Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're exploring Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations theory.
Yes, a theory that really continues to spark debate even decades after it was published.
For sure. And you've sent over some articles of notes looking at how this theory applies to things that are happening today, like the war in Ukraine and what's going on in the Middle East.
Exactly. And while Huntington's writing can be, quite dense, the main point he makes is that in this post-Cold War world, it's going to be cultural and civilizational identities that will be the main sources of conflict.
Replacing like ideological and economic struggles,
Yeah, that's right.
which is really different from like the whole end of history idea that was big back then.
Absolutely. Huntington's framework kind of goes against, the idea that the world's just going to become all liberal democracies.
Right.
Instead, he saw the end of the Cold War as sort of going back to, these historical patterns of conflict, but this time driven by these differences in culture.
So to start with, how does he break down the world into these distinct civilizations?
Okay, so Huntington identifies 8 major civilizations: Western, Orthodox, Islamic, Hindu, Cynic, Japanese, Latin American, and African.
Wow. Okay.
And he argues that each of these has unique, cultural and religious characteristics that shape how they see the world and how they interact with each other.
I mean, right away, that makes me think, isn't that oversimplifying things a bit?
Hmm.
I mean, to put whole nations and cultures into these broad
Yeah,
categories.
you're right. The point that's actually one of the main criticisms of Huntington's theory.
Okay.
Critics say he doesn't really pay attention to the diversity you find within these civilizations.
Makes sense.
And they also say he ignores, how fluid cultural identities can be, especially in a globalized world.
So we've got these like huge civilizational categories on the one hand, and on the other, the reality is people's cultures are complex and kind of overlap.
Right.
How does Huntington deal with that?
Well, he doesn't really reconcile it exactly. He basically says that despite, all this complexity, there are still these core values and beliefs that hold these civilizations together and make them different from each other.
Okay, so can you give us some examples? Like, how would these core values lead to conflict?
Sure. So Huntington puts a lot of emphasis on religion as a key differentiating factor.
Right.
He says that differences in religious beliefs and practices lead to very distinct worldviews and values, and that can cause misunderstandings and tensions between civilizations.
Like, for instance, the idea of individual liberty, which is so important in Western democracies,
Right.
could clash with, say, the emphasis on community values and religious authority you see in some other civilizations.
Exactly. And these differences can lead to conflicts over, political systems, social norms, even things like foreign policy goals.
And another criticism I've heard is that Huntington puts so much focus on culture and religion that he kind of ignores political and economic factors when it comes to conflict.
Yeah, there's that too. Critics say that a lot of conflicts actually come from, power struggles, competition for resources, or historical grievances rather than just cultural differences.
Yeah, like reducing these complex geopolitical situations to just a clash of civilizations doesn't seem to acknowledge all the nuances of international relations.
That's true, but Huntington doesn't completely ignore the importance of politics and economics. He acknowledges their role, but he says they're often intertwined with and shaped by these underlying cultural and religious differences.
So it's not that culture and religion are the only causes of conflict, but they're like the lens through which everything else is viewed.
Exactly. He sees cultural and religious differences as shaping how threats are perceived, who aligns with who, and even what strategies and tactics are used in conflicts.
So that brings us to Huntington's concept of fault lines, right? Those geographical and cultural boundaries where he says conflicts are most likely to happen.
Yes, exactly. And he identifies several key ones, including the border between the West and the Islamic world, which he saw as particularly volatile.
I'm guessing he uses historical examples of conflicts along those fault lines.
He does. He talks about the Crusades, the Ottoman Empire expanding into Europe, and even more recent conflicts in the Middle East.
Right, but again, critics would say those conflicts were also influenced by political ambitions, economic interests, and shifting alliances, not just religion or culture.
Yeah, that's a good point. They argue that focusing just on these civilizational fault lines might make us see these differences as fixed and miss opportunities for cooperation and coexistence.
So it seems like while Huntington's theory is interesting and can help us understand how culture and religion play a role in global politics. We need to be careful not to oversimplify things.
Yes, definitely. No single theory can explain everything that's going on in the world, and we should see Huntington's work as just one way, among many, to try to understand how global politics works. So let's look at how Huntington's theory applies to what's happening today.
You mentioned the rise of China, and it's true, it's hard to ignore the tension between China and the West these days.
Yeah, and Huntington, he actually identified the Sinic civilization, centered around China, as a potential challenger to the West.
No, really?
Yeah, he argued that as China gets more economic and military power, it'll start pushing its own values and interests, and that's going to lead to friction with the West.
I mean, we're already seeing some of that, right, with the trade disputes and competition over technology and also, the strategic rivalry in places like the South China Sea.
Exactly, and all those tensions are made worse by, the cultural differences, historical grievances, and also just how each side sees the other's role in the world, China's model of governance, which some call authoritarian capitalism.
Right.
It's pretty different from the liberal democratic values that the West promotes.
So Huntington basically predicted this clash between the Cynic and Western civilizations.
He did. He thought it would be one of the defining features of the 21st century, potentially even a struggle for, global dominance.
A clash of two totally different worldviews.
Yeah, with really different ideas about, how politics, economics, and society should work.
Okay, but are there any situations where Huntington's theory doesn't really hold up, where maybe cooperation is more important than these civilizational fault lines?
Yeah, there are definitely some cases where his predictions haven't been as accurate, like the Abraham Accords, for example, where Israel normalized relations with several Arab states.
Yeah, that was a big deal, a real diplomatic breakthrough, encouraging cooperation between countries that have a long history of conflict.
Exactly. And it shows that sometimes shared interests and just being pragmatic can be more important than those cultural and religious differences.
Leading to some unexpected alliances and cooperation.
Right. So even though Huntington's theory highlights those areas where conflict could happen, it doesn't mean it's going to happen for sure.
Okay, I see.
It gives us a framework, but it doesn't dictate what's actually going to happen. Human choices, diplomacy, and recognizing shared interests, all those things can still shape how international relations play out.
So let's talk about another conflict that's happening now that seems to fit into Huntington's theory, the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a good example. I mean, the conflict in Ukraine can be seen as this clash between the Western and Orthodox civilizations.
With Russia, which is kind of the main power in the Orthodox world, trying to, assert its influence and push back against the spread of Western values and institutions.
Exactly. Russia sees Ukraine as part of its historical and cultural sphere of influence, and they don't want it to join Western institutions like NATO or the European Union.
Huntington did say that the border between the Western and Orthodox civilizations would be a potential trouble spot.
He did. He talked about the historical tensions between those civilizations going all the way back to the Roman Empire splitting up, and then the rivalry between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East.
And it's sad to see how relevant those historical fault lines still are today with what's happening in Ukraine.
It really shows us how powerful those cultural and religious identities can be, how they can influence who people side with, and even fuel conflict.
But like we said before, it's probably too simple to say that the conflict in Ukraine is only about a clash of civilizations.
Right. Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
there's also political ambitions, security concerns, economic interests, and historical grievances that go way beyond just those civilizational differences.
Right. So Huntington's theory helps us understand the bigger picture, but it's important to remember that there's a lot more going on.
Yeah, it's a multifaceted situation.
And Huntington also talked about the Middle East being a major fault line between the West and the Islamic world.
Right. He thought that after the Cold War, the Middle East would be a hotbed of conflict, driven by those cultural and religious differences, but also political and economic tensions.
And the rise of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda kind of supports his prediction, doesn't it?
Yeah, those groups completely reject Western values and want to establish, a global caliphate based on their interpretation of Islamic law.
And that's fueled this idea that there's this fundamental clash between the West and the Islamic world.
But it's really important to remember that the Middle East isn't just one big homogenous bloc.
Right.
There are a lot of internal divisions within the Islamic world, based on different sects of Islam, political ideologies, and national interests.
And those internal divisions often lead to conflicts that are just as bad, if not worse, than conflicts between civilizations.
And there are also developments like the Abraham Accords, which show that diplomacy and cooperation can actually work, even when there are really deep divisions.
Right, those agreements prove that sometimes, practical considerations and shared interest can be stronger than historical animosity.
So while Huntington's theory gives us a way to think about the potential for conflict in the Middle East, we can't oversimplify things.
So it sounds like when we're applying Huntington's theory to real-world events, we need to be really nuanced in our thinking.
Absolutely. We have to consider all those other factors we talked about, the political ambitions, economic interests, historical grievances, and how those interact with civilizational identities.
And also remember that cooperation and coexistence are still possible.
Even in places where there are deep cultural and religious differences.
Well, we spent a lot of time with Huntington's Clash of Civilizations theory.
Yeah, we've gone through his arguments, looked at what works and what doesn't, and tried to apply it to some of the conflicts we see happening today.
And it's clear that, Huntington's ideas are still really influential in how people think about global politics.
His theory really shows us that culture and religion are still powerful, even in a world that's supposed to be, more secular and connected.
Right. He makes us think about the possibility that, even though globalization is bringing us closer, those differences in values could still cause conflict.
But, like we've been talking about, we have to be careful not to oversimplify things.
Yeah, we can't just say that every conflict is just about a clash of civilizations.
Exactly. We need to consider those other factors, the political ambitions, economic interests, and historical grievances, along with the cultural and religious differences.
And remember that, cooperation and coexistence are still possible.
Even between civilizations with different values and beliefs.
The Abraham Accords show that diplomacy can work, that you can find common ground even when there are big historical and cultural differences.
Definitely.
So I think Huntington's theory is kind of a warning.
A warning.
Yeah, it reminds us that, the world isn't automatically moving towards some kind of perfect harmony.
Right, that makes sense.
Culture and religion are still important, and those differences in values can cause misunderstanding, tension, and even conflict.
But it's important to remember that Huntington wasn't saying this clash is inevitable.
Okay, so it's not like a prophecy.
Exactly. It's more like a framework to help us understand where conflict might come from, and also a call to, try to understand and respect each other better, to have more dialogue between cultures and religions.
So in a world that's so interconnected, being able to deal with those differences peacefully is going to be crucial.
It really will. We need diplomacy. We need to be willing to see things from other perspectives and to recognize that we're all human, even if we have different backgrounds.
I guess after this deep dive, I'm left with this sense of both the challenges and the opportunities we're facing.
That's a good way to put it.
Huntington's theory makes us think about how culture and globalization interact and how that shapes the world.
It shows us the potential for conflict, but also reminds us that we have the power to choose our path, to build a more peaceful and cooperative world.
And it encourages us to engage with other cultures, not with fear, but with a real desire to understand and bridge the divides between us.
That's a great point.
Maybe that's what we should take away from Huntington's work, that the future isn't about some inevitable clash, but about the choices we make and how we work together to build understanding and cooperation across cultures and religions.